It was a cold autumn evening when Mark and his friends decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. They were eager for a break from the stresses of their everyday lives, wanting nothing more than a peaceful retreat surrounded by nature. The cabin, isolated and tucked away, seemed perfect for their plans. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin was old but charming, with wooden floors that creaked and a fireplace that crackled in the living room. There was an eerie stillness to the place, but no one thought much of it. Mark and his friends settled in, enjoying the night with music, laughter, and drinks. The only light in the cabin came from the dim glow of the fireplace and a few candles scattered around. As the evening wore on, they began to feel an odd sense of unease. It wasn't the darkness or the isolation, but something else, a quiet, lurking presence. Mark chalked it up to the atmosphere of the cabin, but every so often he would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. At first he thought it was just the flickering shadows, but it didn't stop. A figure, tall, dark, and fleeting, always moving in the periphery of his vision. Around midnight, the group decided to go to bed. They split up into two rooms. Mark and his friend Jason took one room, and the rest of the group stayed in the other. Mark tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He tossed and turned, eventually getting up to use the bathroom. As he walked down the narrow hallway, a sudden coldness swept over him. It was like the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. He felt a presence behind him, but when he turned around, the hallway was empty. The house was eerily silent, except for the soft sound of creaking wood. He continued to the bathroom, but when he reached the door, he froze. The door was slightly ajar. He didn't remember leaving it that way. As he pushed the door open, a chill ran down his spine. Inside, the mirror was cracked, the glass spiderwebbed with lines that seemed to move, shift, and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The water in the sink was running, its sound echoing through the room like it was coming from far away. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something in the reflection behind him. A figure, standing still, its face hidden in shadow. His heart raced. He whipped around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the reflection of the bathroom, the cracked mirror, and the faint sound of the water. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. He quickly turned off the tap and left the bathroom, but the sensation of something watching him only grew stronger. As he walked back to his room, the hallway seemed longer, darker, and colder than before. The shadowy figure seemed to move just out of his line of sight, always following him, always just behind him. When Mark returned to his room, he found Jason asleep, oblivious to the creeping dread that had taken over the cabin. Mark climbed back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside felt like it was a warning, a sign that something was wrong. Around 3 a.m., he heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails against wood, coming from the other side of the wall. At first, he tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder, faster, more frantic. It was as if whatever was on the other side was trying to break through. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He got out of bed and walked to the wall, pressing his ear against it. The tapping continued, but now there was something else, a low, guttural whisper, a voice that he couldn't understand, but it sent shivers down his spine. He backed away, his mind racing. He wanted to wake Jason, but when he looked over at him, he saw that Jason was no longer lying in bed. His blanket was tossed aside, and the bed was empty. Mark's blood ran cold. He called out Jason's name, but there was no answer. Panicked, he searched the cabin, calling for his friend, but it was as if the entire place had swallowed him whole. The walls seemed to close in around him. The coldness intensified. He reached the living room, and that's when he saw it. Jason was standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. His back was to Mark, and his body was unnaturally still. The room was deathly silent, except for the low, slithering sound coming from Jason's direction. Mark approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out to touch his friend's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Jason's head snapped around, his eyes wide and empty. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. His face was pale, gaunt. His skin stretched tight over his bones. He spoke, his voice hollow and wrong, as if it were coming from somewhere deep underground. "Leave! It's coming! It's too late!" Before Mark could react, Jason's body jerked violently, his limbs snapping at unnatural angles. The air grew colder, the lights flickering erratically, casting long, disturbing shadows on the walls. The tapping sound returned, now coming from all directions, from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the house, suffocating Mark with their urgency. Mark stumbled backward, fear taking over, and as he turned to flee, he saw the shadow in the hallway. The same tall, dark figure from earlier, standing motionless, its features hidden in the blackness. But now the figure was different. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the darkness like twin flames. And in that moment, Mark knew. He knew that whatever was in the cabin had been waiting for them for years, and it wasn't done with them yet. He ran, not knowing where to go, only knowing that he had to escape. He bolted out the front door, his breath fogging in the icy air. But as he turned to look back at the cabin, the figure appeared in the doorway, watching him with those glowing eyes. Mark never returned to the cabin. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the place abandoned, as if no one had ever been there. No sign of Mark, Jason, or the others. The cabin remained, just as it always had, standing alone in the woods. And as the years passed, the stories grew. People said the cabin was cursed, that whoever stayed there would never leave. And sometimes, if you were out in the woods at night, you could hear the tapping, the whispers, and the faint sound of footsteps following you, never letting you go.
Story number 2.
It was a rainy evening when Sarah, a young journalist, arrived at an old, abandoned asylum deep in the countryside. The facility had been shut down for decades, ever since a series of gruesome events occurred that left a stain on the place's history. The asylum had once housed patients with severe mental disorders, but now it was nothing but crumbling walls and forgotten memories. Rumors of strange happenings and disappearances still circulated around the town, but Sarah, ever the skeptic, was determined to uncover the truth behind the place. She had heard the stories from the locals, the whispers about the patients who had disappeared, about the strange figures that had been seen in the windows long after the building had been abandoned. But she wasn't afraid. She was a journalist, used to tracking down the facts and exposing the truth. The rain made the road slippery as she pulled up to the asylum. Its towering silhouette loomed against the gray sky, dark windows staring down at her like empty, soulless eyes. The iron gates were rusted, but still intact, and they creaked open when she pushed against them. She stepped onto the grounds, her boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the wind howled through the empty halls as if the building itself was calling out to her. She made her way inside, her flashlight cutting through the dark corridors. The asylum was even more unsettling on the inside. Long hallways lined with broken doors, peeling wallpaper, and shattered glass. The silence was almost deafening. The further she walked, the heavier the air seemed to get, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced and twisted around her. As she ventured deeper into the asylum, she came across a room at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and from the darkness within, she could hear a soft, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Curious, Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was a patient's cell, completely untouched by time. The bed was still there, its sheets frayed and yellowed. The walls were covered in strange markings, scratches, symbols, and words written in what looked like blood. But it was the thumping that drew her attention. She looked around the room, but saw nothing at first. The sound seemed to be coming from the floor. She crouched down, her flashlight illuminating the ground. At first, it seemed like an illusion. The floor was cracked, but it wasn't unusual for a building this old. But then she saw it, something shifting beneath the floorboards. The thumping grew louder, faster, almost as if it was in sync with her heartbeat. Suddenly, one of the floorboards gave way, and from the darkness beneath it, a hand shot up, grabbing Sarah by the wrist. Her scream echoed through the halls as she struggled to break free, but the hand tightened around her, its fingers cold and unnaturally strong. She jerked back, managing to break free from the grip, But as she looked down, she saw the thing that had reached up to grab her. A pale, emaciated face peered out from the darkness beneath the floor, its eyes wide and unblinking. It was a woman, or at least what had once been a woman. Her skin was stretched tight over her bones, her hair matted and greasy, and her mouth twisted into a horrific smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Leave," the woman whispered, her voice raspy as if it hadn't been used in years. "Leave before it's too late." Sarah backed away, her heart racing. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls. She tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The walls seemed to shift, the air growing colder with each passing second. Suddenly, the thumping started again, this time louder and closer, as if it was all around her. The woman's face appeared in the corner of her vision, her eyes following Sarah's every move. The whispering began, soft at first like the wind, but it quickly grew into a chorus of voices, voices from the past, from the patients who had once been trapped inside the asylum. "Help us. We never left. It never lets us leave." Sarah could feel their presence now, hundreds of eyes on her, watching her every move. She could almost hear their breath, feel their cold fingers brushing against her skin. They were closing in, pulling her deeper into the asylum, into the darkness where no one could hear her scream. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it stepped forward, tall and hulking, its silhouette casting a long shadow across the walls. It had no face, no features, just a massive, dark figure with arms that reached out toward her. Without thinking, Sarah ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get out. The asylum seemed to stretch forever, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. She could hear the figure behind her, its footsteps thundering, growing closer with every passing second. As she rounded a corner, she collided with something cold and solid. She looked up, only to find herself face to face with the woman from the floor, her mouth agape in a silent scream. Behind her, the shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating. In that moment, Sarah understood the truth. The asylum had never let go of its inhabitants. The patients, the tortured souls, they were still there, trapped in the dark, waiting for the next victim to fall into their grasp. The last thing Sarah heard before everything went dark was the voice of the woman whispering one final time, "You should have never come here." The next morning, the asylum was silent once again. The rain had stopped, and the sun had begun to peek through the clouds, but Sarah was never seen again. The police searched the area, but there was no sign of her. The asylum remained as it always had, empty, abandoned, but still carrying the weight of its horrors. And sometimes if you stand outside the asylum at night, you can still hear the thumping, the whispers, and the faint echo of footsteps, waiting for someone else to come too close.
Story number 3.
It was a typical Friday evening when Emma and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. They had been planning the getaway for weeks, and Emma, always the skeptic, was excited to escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. The cabin was old, nestled deep in the woods, and far away from the nearest town. No one had ever mentioned the cabin's dark history to her, and she didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The moment they arrived, the weather seemed to take a turn for the worse. The once clear sky quickly turned overcast, and a heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the cabin and the surrounding trees. It wasn't unusual for the area to get foggy, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, she brushed it aside. The cabin had everything they needed: comfortable furniture, a well-stocked kitchen, and a large fireplace that would keep them warm throughout the weekend. They spent the evening relaxing, playing games, and enjoying drinks by the fire. The storm outside raged on, with the wind howling and the trees creaking under the pressure of the storm. The night grew late, and Emma, feeling a bit tired, excused herself to go to bed. As she made her way down the dark hallway toward her room, she passed an old mirror that hung on the wall. It was dusty, its edges frayed and worn, but she paused for a moment, glancing into it. For just a split second, she thought she saw a shadowy figure behind her, standing in the doorway to the living room. It was gone the moment she turned around. Her heart skipped a beat, but she dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light, or maybe just her mind playing tricks on her. She went to her room, shutting the door behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As she lay in bed, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Light, shuffling steps that seemed to move past her door, then fade into the distance. Emma's pulse quickened. She told herself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind making noises as it howled through the trees. But then she heard something else, a soft, whispering voice, like a low hum or murmured words coming from the darkness just beyond her door. "Emma," the voice called, faint but clear. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable. It sounded like it was right outside her door. It whispered again, this time louder, "Emma, come out and play." Her body froze and her mind raced. She knew it wasn't one of her friends. No one had called her name. It couldn't be. She got out of bed, her legs trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door slowly, peering into the hallway, but there was no one there. Just the dim glow of the storm outside, casting strange shadows on the walls. Confused and terrified, she closed the door behind her and went back to bed, trying to convince herself it was all in her head. But the whispers didn't stop. The low, eerie voice continued to call her name, over and over, getting louder each time. She tried to block it out, to ignore it, but the voice persisted. Finally, she could stand it no longer. She grabbed her flashlight and ventured into the hallway, her pulse racing. The house was silent now, except for the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. As she moved down the hallway toward the living room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mirror, the one she had passed earlier, was no longer where it had been. It was now leaning against the wall, turned at an angle so that it faced the doorway. And in the reflection, she saw something. A figure standing behind her, tall and cloaked in shadows. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure in the mirror moved closer, its form shifting as if it were reaching toward her. Frozen in place, she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure lifted a hand, and for the briefest moment, she saw a pair of cold, glowing eyes staring back at her from the depths of the shadow. The eyes were empty, hollow, but somehow full of malice. She bolted, running toward the front door, desperate to escape. But as she grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. She pulled at it, yanking with all her strength, but the door was locked. She felt trapped, like something was closing in around her. The whispers filled the room again, louder now, as if they were all around her, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "Play with us, Emma. Come play." Terror flooded her veins. She turned to run, but the house itself seemed to be changing, the walls stretching, the hallway growing longer, as if the building were alive, contorting and shifting to trap her inside. Suddenly, she heard a loud crash from the living room, followed by frantic footsteps. Emma sprinted toward the sound, her mind racing. She couldn't get out. There was no escape. When she entered the living room, her friends were gone. The furniture was overturned and the fire had gone out. The house was freezing, cold air rushing through the room. Then she saw it. The figure from the mirror standing in the doorway, smiling a twisted, grotesque smile. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and as it stepped forward, she could hear the whisper again, louder and more menacing. "Play with us, forever." Emma tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its hand outstretched toward her. She backed away, but the room seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls pressing in as though the house was swallowing her whole. In one final desperate attempt, she lunged for the window, hoping to break it and escape. But as she looked outside, there was no sky, just a swirling black void, an endless abyss that seemed to pull her in. And then everything went dark. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun broke through the clouds, but when her friends went to check on her, Emma was gone. No one saw her leave. The door was still locked, the window untouched. The only thing they found was the old mirror, lying face down on the floor of the living room, a faint, bloody handprint smeared across the glass. No one knows what happened to Emma that night, and the cabin remains abandoned, forgotten by most. But sometimes, if you pass by it on a stormy night, you can hear faint whispers carried on the wind, calling out for someone to come and play. And sometimes, just before the fog rolls in, you might catch a glimpse of something watching from the window, its glowing eyes staring back at you.
Story number 4.
It was a quiet evening when Daniel and his wife, Sarah, moved into their new home, a secluded, old farmhouse at the edge of a dense forest. The house had been on the market for years, and while the price was far lower than expected, they were thrilled with the idea of having their own place in the countryside. The house had character, with creaky floorboards and a large, ancient fireplace that seemed to whisper with the wind. But it was the woods that intrigued them the most, tall trees that loomed like giants, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The first few days in the house were peaceful, filled with unpacking and settling in. However, as night fell on the third day, things began to feel wrong. It started with small noises, creaks in the floorboards that they couldn't explain, the occasional tap against the window, like something was gently pressing itself against the glass. At first, Daniel wrote it off as the house settling, but Sarah began to notice it too. Late one evening, after a long day of unpacking, they sat together in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly. The house was completely still, and the only sounds were the occasional gusts of wind outside. Sarah glanced toward the window, feeling an odd sense of unease creeping up her spine. The curtains were drawn, but she could have sworn she saw something move, just a shadow passing by. She thought it was the reflection of the tree branches swaying in the wind, but the movement seemed deliberate, almost human. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked up from his book. "See what?" "Something outside," she said, voice trembling. "It looked like a person." Daniel chuckled softly, trying to ease her nerves. "It's probably just a branch. The wind's playing tricks on you." But Sarah wasn't convinced. For the next few nights, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She started closing the curtains tightly every evening, but it didn't help. One night, as Daniel slept soundly beside her, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She heard a faint tapping at the window. It was rhythmic, almost as if someone was knocking. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The tapping continued, then stopped, then started again, a little louder this time. It seemed to come from the side of the house, near the corner, just outside their bedroom window. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah got up and approached the window. She peeked through the curtain, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the darkness just beyond the glass, was a figure, tall, thin, and pale, its face hidden in shadow. It was motionless, staring at her, unmoving, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but before she could react, the figure slowly stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. She stood there, frozen, unable to move. She was sure she had seen it, sure that something was out there. The next morning, she told Daniel about what happened, but he didn't seem as alarmed. "You probably just imagined it," he said. "There's nothing out there. It's just a shadow." But Sarah couldn't let it go. That night, she decided to stay awake, watching the window, waiting for the figure to return. The house was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves outside. Hours passed, and she began to feel foolish for staying up so late. Maybe it was just the stress of moving, maybe she was just tired. Then the tapping started again. She jumped to her feet, her pulse racing. The sound was unmistakable, faint, deliberate knocks at the window. She crept toward it, her mind racing with fear. This time, she pulled the curtain back just a little, enough to peer outside. What she saw made her blood run cold. The figure was back, standing in the same spot as before, but this time, it was closer, much closer. It was standing just a few feet away from the window, its face still hidden in shadow, its form impossibly tall and thin. Its hands were pressed against the glass, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, reaching toward her. A low whispering sound came from outside, like a voice speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Sarah stumbled back, terrified, but as she turned to run, the figure suddenly vanished. The house fell silent again. The next morning, Sarah was unable to shake the feeling of dread. She was too scared to sleep, too scared to even look out the window. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. But Daniel, ever the skeptic, insisted that everything was fine. "You're just exhausted," he said. "You need rest." But that night, things took a darker turn. At around midnight, Sarah woke to the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, dragging as if whoever was walking was stumbling, dragging their feet. She waited, holding her breath, the noise growing louder with each step. The door to their bedroom creaked open. In the doorway stood the figure. It was taller now, its face still hidden in shadow, its fingers twitching like they were anticipating something. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her with an air of malevolent intent. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. She was frozen, unable to look away from the figure's hollow eyes. Then suddenly, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark hallway. This time, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She woke Daniel, shaking him awake. "There's something in the house, something out there," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel, still groggy from sleep, grabbed the flashlight and went to investigate. He checked the locks, the windows, the entire house, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone, just the usual creaks and groans of an old house. He returned to bed, telling Sarah she must have been dreaming, but Sarah knew better. She could still feel the weight of the figure's presence in the house, pressing in on her from every corner. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed to make her jump, every creak in the floor made her hold her breath. But then, just as she thought she might finally drift off, she heard it, a soft whisper, close to her ear, like a breath on her skin. "Leave." It was faint but unmistakable. The voice wasn't Daniel's. It was cold, hollow, and deep. The whisper was followed by a scraping sound, like something dragging against the floor. Sarah's heart stopped. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it. The figure, the whispers, the footsteps, they were all real. Something was in the house with them, something ancient, something evil. They didn't stay another night. The next morning, Daniel finally agreed they needed to leave. The house wasn't safe. They packed their things in a hurry and left, not once looking back. To this day, no one knows who or what was in that house. But some say that if you drive by on a stormy night, you can still see the silhouette of a tall, thin figure standing in the window, watching, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faintest whisper, barely audible on the wind. "Leave."
Story number 5.
It was the middle of winter when Rachel and her friends decided to rent a cabin deep in the mountains for a weekend getaway. The cabin was rustic, perched on the edge of a dense forest, and although the roads leading up to it were difficult to navigate, they were excited for the seclusion and escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The snow had been falling heavily all afternoon, and by the time they arrived, the entire area was blanketed in white, giving the forest an eerie, otherworldly appearance. The group settled in, stoking the fire in the large stone fireplace and settling around the living room with drinks and snacks. The storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, it was cozy. They played games and laughed late into the night, but as the clock ticked past midnight, things began to feel strange. A chill settled into the air, even though the fire was still burning strong. The wind howled outside, but it sounded different, almost like something was whispering along with it. Rachel was the first to notice. She had been sitting on the couch, listening to the wind when she saw it, a shadow moving outside the window. It was too quick to make out, but she could have sworn it was a person. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just the trees swaying in the wind, but a strange unease crept over her. "Did you see that?" she asked, glancing at her friends. They all shook their heads, dismissing it as nothing more than her imagination. But when Rachel went to the window to check, the sight of the trees outside seemed off. The branches were swaying, yes, but there was a figure standing among them, its face obscured by the darkness. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She backed away from the window, too afraid to look again. But when she turned back to her friends, she noticed that none of them were paying attention. They were all staring at the fire, lost in their own thoughts. "Didn't you see it?" she asked again, her voice shaking. But none of them answered. They just continued to stare ahead, completely still. Feeling uneasy, Rachel excused herself and went upstairs to the room she was sharing with her best friend Claire. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But the feeling didn't go away. As the night dragged on, She kept hearing strange noises from downstairs, soft scraping, faint whispers, and a low, guttural growl that made her stomach turn. She convinced herself it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew something was out there. Hours later, she was just about to fall asleep when she heard footsteps outside their bedroom door. They were slow, deliberate steps. Someone or something was walking around the hallway, just outside the room. Rachel held her breath, straining to listen. The steps continued, getting closer to their door. Then they stopped, right outside. A soft whisper came through the crack beneath the door. "Rachel?" She froze. The voice was low, almost gentle, but there was something deeply wrong about it. It was calling her name, but it didn't sound like anyone she knew. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the door, but Rachel couldn't move. Her mind was racing, her body paralyzed with fear. She wanted to scream, to get Claire's attention, but no sound came from her throat. Just when she thought she might go mad, the door suddenly creaked open. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the opening door, only to find it was empty. No one was there. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the silence broken only by the wind howling outside. But then a new noise emerged, a faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. Rachel's eyes darted to the corner, where a small shadow seemed to move, almost as if something was crawling on the floor, just beyond the edge of the bed. It grew louder, closer, and then she saw it. A face. A pale, gaunt face emerging from the shadows, its eyes wide and black, its mouth stretched in an unnatural, twisted grin. She screamed, throwing herself back against the wall, but the face continued to crawl toward her, its body contorting and twisting at impossible angles. Rachel tried to scream again, but the air was thick, suffocating, and the only thing she could hear was the sound of that creature's breathing, each exhale rasping and wet. Just as it reached her, Claire stirred in the bed, groggily waking up. Rachel tried to shout, to warn her, but her voice was gone, stolen by the terrifying thing now standing inches from her face. The creature's breath was cold, its eyes never blinking as it stared directly into hers. And then, without warning, it vanished. The creature was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Rachel blinked, gasping for breath. She turned to Claire, but when she tried to speak, her words caught in her throat. "Claire, wake up!" She finally managed to whisper. But Claire didn't respond. She was lying there, motionless, her face pale and cold. Rachel reached out to shake her, but Claire's body felt stiff, unnatural, as though she had been dead for hours. Panic surged through Rachel as she scrambled to get out of bed. But when she turned to leave the room, she saw something in the doorway. There, in the dark hallway, stood the figure from earlier, the tall, shadowy figure with the same black eyes, watching her. It didn't move. It just stood there, silently staring, waiting for her to make the first move. But Rachel knew what it wanted, and it wasn't just her. The creature was here for all of them. With one final desperate scream, she turned and bolted down the hallway, running for the door. But no matter how fast she ran, the house seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls closing in around her. The whispers were louder now, echoing in her ears, filling her mind. "Rachel, come back." The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was that pale, twisted face, grinning wider than ever, its teeth sharp and yellow, its eyes still black as the night. The next morning, when the police arrived to investigate the strange disappearances, they found the cabin completely abandoned. The fire had long since gone out, the windows cracked open, and the snow piled up around the door. But no sign of Rachel, Claire, or any of her friends could be found. The only evidence left behind was a single handprint, smeared across the doorframe, its fingers long and unnaturally twisted. Some say the creature still waits in that cabin, hidden in the forest, calling to anyone who dares to venture too close. And if you listen closely on a quiet winter night, you might hear the whispers of Rachel's voice just before it's stolen by the darkness once more. Come play with us.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods. Anna and her fiancé, Mike, had rented the cabin to get away from the noise of city life. It was secluded, nestled deep in a dense forest with no neighbors for miles, and they thought it would be the perfect way to unwind. They drove for hours to reach the cabin, the roads winding and treacherous as they slowly ascended into the mountains. When they arrived, The sun was beginning to set, and the air had a chill to it, which only added to the sense of isolation. The cabin was everything they expected, rustic and cozy, with large windows that offered a view of the sprawling forest. There was a large stone fireplace in the living room, and the place seemed perfect for a weekend of relaxation. But as the evening progressed, an unsettling feeling crept over Anna. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, just a sense of being watched, a tingling sensation at the back of her neck. Mike didn't seem to notice it, and Anna chalked it up to nerves. After all, they were far from home in an unfamiliar place. That night, as they sat by the fire, the wind began to pick up. The trees outside swayed violently, their branches scraping against the cabin walls like gnarled fingers. The sound of the wind seemed almost unnatural, too loud, too harsh. It howled through the cracks in the wood, and the cabin seemed to groan in response. Anna tried to ignore it, but the longer she sat there, the more she began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Just after midnight, while they were both drifting off to sleep, there was a loud bang on the window. Anna shot upright, her heart racing. Mike stirred beside her, groggily mumbling something about the wind, but Anna wasn't so sure. The bang was too forceful, too deliberate. She stood up from the bed and walked cautiously toward the window, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing outside, just the dark, empty forest. But as she turned to leave, she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms that seemed to hang down to its knees. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but Anna could feel its gaze on her, piercing through the darkness. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she could sense its presence, watching, waiting. She turned back to Mike, but when she looked at him, he was asleep, his face peaceful and unaware. Anna's stomach twisted with fear. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond her sight. The next morning, Mike was in good spirits, eager to explore the surrounding woods. But Anna couldn't shake the unease she felt. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she was being followed. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing thicker as they ventured further into the forest. As they walked, Anna kept hearing strange noises, branches snapping underfoot, faint whispers carried on the wind. But when she looked around, there was nothing. Mike didn't seem to hear anything, and she felt foolish for worrying. As the day wore on, Anna began to feel the presence of something watching her again, but this time, it wasn't just the feeling. It was the eyes. Every time she looked back, she saw them, those same cold, empty eyes, watching her from between the trees. The figure was still there, stalking them from the shadows, always just out of sight, but close enough to make her skin crawl. When they returned to the cabin that evening, Anna was on edge. She told Mike about the figure, but he laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal or a trick of the light. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling. The figure was real, and it was still out there. That night, as they sat by the fire, there was a knock on the door. It was soft at first, like the tapping of a branch against the wood, but then it grew louder. 3 firm knocks, followed by a pause, then another knock. Anna's blood ran cold. Mike looked at her, confused. Who could it be, he asked, but Anna couldn't answer. She stared at the door, frozen in fear. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. Mike stood up, slowly making his way to the door. Anna tried to warn him, but her voice was trapped in her throat. She watched as he reached for the handle, her heart racing in her chest. But before he could open the door, the knocking suddenly stopped. It was so sudden, it sent a chill down her spine. Mike paused, his hand still on the doorknob, and turned back to Anna. Maybe it's just an animal, he said, though there was doubt in his voice. But Anna knew. She knew that what was out there was no animal. It was something far worse. Mike opened the door cautiously, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the porch and the surrounding woods, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone, just the empty, silent forest. Mike sighed, relieved, and shut the door. But as he turned to go back inside, Anna noticed something in the reflection of the glass. Something dark, standing just outside the window, tall and unnaturally thin, its long arms pressed against the glass. It wasn't just standing there, it was smiling, a grotesque, twisted smile stretching across its face. Anna screamed, but Mike didn't hear her. He turned around, and when he saw the figure, his face went pale. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, its black eyes fixed on them. "Get away from the window," Anna shouted, but Mike was frozen, his eyes locked on the creature. The smile grew wider, more sinister, as the figure began to press harder against the glass, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Suddenly, the glass shattered. The creature lunged forward, its long fingers reaching for Mike, but before it could make contact, it vanished into the darkness. Mike stumbled backward, pulling Anna into his arms, terrified. The cabin was now filled with an oppressive, suffocating silence. They grabbed their things, trying to leave, but when they opened the door, the figure was standing in front of them, blocking their escape. It whispered, its voice deep and guttural, "You're not leaving." And then the door slammed shut behind them. The last thing anyone ever heard from the cabin was the sound of desperate screaming, echoing through the woods. By the time the authorities arrived, there was nothing left. No trace of Anna, Mike, or the cabin. Just an eerie silence that filled the empty woods, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. And if you happen to wander too close to the woods where the cabin once stood, you might hear something on the wind, a whisper, faint and cold. "Don't come closer, you're next."